In 1825, the world lost a man who had once stood face to face with Napoleon and won. A man who ruled over the vast, icy reaches of the Russian Empire. A man crowned by fate, but haunted by it every step of the way. That man was Tsar Alexander I. He was just 47 when he died suddenly in the faraway port city of Taganrog on the Sea of Azov. The official cause? Typhus. His death was abrupt, quiet, and strange. Too strange. Because from the moment the news hit St. Petersburg, whispers began to circulate, not just among the grieving aristocracy or the court elites, but among soldiers, priests, and commoners alike. Was the Tsar truly dead? Or had he done the unthinkable and vanished? Cut 2. Candle-lit imperial hallways, a crown on a red cushion, fading into empty rooms. You see, Alexander wasn't like most monarchs. He never seemed comfortable on the throne. Yes, he defeated Napoleon. Yes, he carried Russia through the storm of Europe's wars. But behind his regal appearance was a man racked with guilt, loss, and spiritual unrest. He had seen too much, done too much, and perhaps he wanted out. Some said he found politics distasteful. Others believed he was tormented by his complicity in his father's murder, Tsar Paul I, who was assassinated in 1801. Alexander was just 23 then, and although he didn't wield the blade, many believed he allowed it to happen. That guilt never left him. Dramatic pause, cut to an old Orthodox monastery, snow falling. So what if, just what if, he had staged his own death? It sounds like a fantasy, right? Something out of a novel. But here's where it gets interesting. Not long after his supposed death, rumors began emerging of a mysterious hermit living in Siberia under the name Feodor Kuzmich. He lived simply, spoke like a noble, quoted scripture like a scholar, and carried himself like a man born to rule. He refused to explain where he came from, but his knowledge of court affairs, fluent French, and behavior left many convinced. This wasn't just some random monk. This was Alexander himself, reborn as a penitent soul. Even his closest aides in the imperial court had their doubts. The body that was supposedly buried back in St. Petersburg, some claimed it looked different, as if a substitution had taken place. A decoy. Insert question to audience. Soft piano cue. But here's the deeper question we should ask. Why would a czar give up everything? Was it spiritual redemption, a desire for anonymity, or the crushing weight of an empire that even victory couldn't lighten? Remember, this was a man who lived through Europe's darkest wars, who brokered peace at the Congress of Vienna, who stared into the abyss of human ambition and saw what it did to people like Napoleon. Maybe he saw what it was doing to himself. Cut to black and white imagery of Feodor Kuzmich. Faint wind sounds. Feodor Kuzmich died in 1864, decades after Alexander's supposed death, and on his deathbed, when asked once more about his identity, the hermit simply smiled and said nothing. To this day, historians remain divided. DNA tests? Never conclusively done. Imperial documents? Inconclusive. But the mystery lives on, because maybe, just maybe, the greatest act of power was walking away from it. Final words, with slow zoom on snowy Russian landscape. So what do you think? Was Tsar AlexanderI really buried in a distant palace tomb? Or did he choose silence over ceremony, retreat over rain, and finally find peace as a nameless monk in the vast, quiet wilderness? Sometimes the greatest kings are the ones history loses on purpose. In 1801, a young man just 23 years old was thrust onto the throne of the Russian Empire. That man was Alexander Romanov, soon to be known as Tsar Alexander I. But his rise to power wasn't a story of triumph. It was a tragedy soaked in shadows. His father, Tsar Paul I, had been assassinated. strangled in his own palace by conspirators. And though Alexander never publicly admitted it, there are signs he knew the plot was coming and did nothing to stop it. Imagine that. Becoming emperor not through destiny, but through quiet betrayal. From the very beginning, Alexander wore his crown not with pride, but with burden. In his early years, he tried to reshape Russia. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals, he spoke of justice, education, and reform. For a moment, it seemed like he might become the philosopher king Russia had never had. He abolished torture, reformed schools, even dreamed of freeing the serfs. But dreams don't last long in a world of war, and the 19th century was anything but peaceful. Alexander would soon be pulled into the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars. He faced the greatest military genius of the age, Napoleon Bonaparte, and somehow, against all odds, he won. In 1812, after Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia, Alexander marched triumphantly through the ruins of Europe. At the Congress of Vienna, he sat as a victor, powerful, revered, admired. But something had changed. Victory didn't bring him peace. It brought him emptiness. He returned to Russia a different man. The young reformer was gone. In his place stood a ruler who trusted no one, who spoke little, and who seemed to be drifting inward. He became obsessed with questions of fate, sin, and divine punishment. Was it guilt over his father's death? Was it the weight of millions of lives lost in war? Or something deeper, something more spiritual? We may never know exactly, but we do know this. By the 1820s, Tsar Alexander had withdrawn almost completely from politics and public life. He avoided the capital, avoided his ministers. Even his family sometimes didn't know where he was. He spent more and more time in remote locations, reading religious texts, meeting with mystics, and pondering the soul. One of his aides once said, "The emperor spoke often of repentance, and rarely of rule." He began to see his crown not as a symbol of glory, but as a curse, a divine test, a reminder of bloodshed and betrayal that he could never wash clean. And this inner torment would only grow, because Alexander wasn't just retreating from politics, he was retreating from himself, and in time, he would disappear altogether. It was late 1825, and the Russian Empire, vast, powerful, and restless, was still reeling from years of war and uncertainty. But far from the glittering palaces of St. Petersburg, in a quiet port town called Taganrog, something unexpected was about to happen. The Tsar disappeared. Tsar Alexander I had traveled to Taganrog under mysterious circumstances. He said he needed rest, escape, maybe even healing. But to those who knew him best, it felt more like exile. He had been withdrawing from public life for years, avoiding the capital, delegating power, and plunging deeper into religion and mysticism. Now here he was, hundreds of miles from the empire's heart, alone with his thoughts and haunted by his past. Then, suddenly, he fell ill. Reports say he suffered from fever, fatigue, and delirium. Doctors called it typhus, a disease known for sweeping through armies and killing without mercy. And just like that, on December 1st, 1825, Tsar Alexander I was declared dead. He was only 47 years old. But this is where the story turns from history into legend. Because something wasn't right. For starters, his funeral was closed casket, highly unusual for a man of such stature. Russia had long traditions of honoring their czars with open displays, elaborate processions, and full public mourning. But in Alexander's case, the lid stayed shut. Why? Well, some of the few who claimed to have seen the body whispered that it didn't quite look like him. The face was thinner, the hands more calloused, the overall appearance off. Even stranger? Within hours of his death, the imperial court kicked into overdrive, rushing to secure succession, swearing in new authority, and silencing questions. To the outside world, everything looked normal. The empire mourned. The people prayed. But behind closed doors? Rumors exploded. Was the Tsar truly dead? Or had he staged the perfect disappearance? Because think about it. Here was a ruler who had grown increasingly disillusioned with politics. A man tormented by guilt, obsessed with faith, disconnected from courtly life. He had the power, the resources, and the motive to vanish and make it look convincing. Some began to wonder, was Taganrog not a place of death, but a doorway to rebirth? What kind of person walks away from an empire? Was it cowardice? A desperate attempt to find peace? Or was it the most courageous act of all, to give up absolute power in pursuit of something deeper? One theory began to spread like wildfire across Russia, that Alexander hadn't died, but instead had swapped places with a look-alike, faked his illness, and escaped, to live as a simple man of faith. And if that sounds far-fetched, just wait, because the next chapter will make you question everything. In the years following his death, sightings began to emerge, in remote villages, in monasteries, in whispers passed down from old priests to young disciples. A hermit, a wanderer, a man called Feodor Kuzmich, who spoke like a noble but lived like a saint. In 1836, over a decade after the supposed death of Tsar Alexander I, a quiet, elderly man appeared in the cold, remote expanses of Siberia. He gave his name as Feodor Kuzmich. No documents, no past, no family, just a humble walking stick, deep-set eyes, and a voice that carried more than wisdom. It carried history. At first glance, Feodor looked like any other wandering ascetic. Thin, ragged, deeply religious. He spoke little of his past, choosing instead a life of prayer and solitude. But it didn't take long for people to realize. This man was different. He was fluent in French, the language of Russian nobility and the European courts. He carried himself with a grace that didn't belong to a peasant. He wrote with remarkable clarity, and when he spoke, he sometimes slipped, referencing palaces, generals, and wars in the first person. One local monk would later write, "He spoke of Napoleon not as history, but as memory." Who was this man? Where had he come from? When questioned, Feodor gave cryptic answers. He'd smile gently and say, "I was once someone, but now I am no one." That only made the rumors louder. Some believed he was a noble in exile. Others said he was a prophet. But one theory kept coming back, again and again. Feodor Kuzmich was Tsar Alexander I. Think about it. The dates lined up. Alexander was declared dead in 1825. Feodor appeared in 1836. Just enough time for a man to disappear, travel, and reinvent himself. His knowledge of military campaigns, court etiquette, and spiritual philosophy was far too detailed to be coincidence. And then there was the way he moved. Shoulders square, back straight, eyes always watching. He carried the weight of someone who once ruled, and then walked away from it all. What kind of man trades a throne for a life of obscurity? What pain, what guilt, what longing for peace must have driven him to Siberia, to a life of fasting, prayer, and solitude? Maybe Alexander didn't want to die. Maybe he wanted to be reborn. Feodor Kuzmich lived for nearly 30 years in Siberia. He never sought power, never returned to politics, never tried to reclaim his name. He spent his days healing the sick, offering spiritual guidance, and quietly atoning, perhaps not just for his past as a ruler, but for his silence during his father's murder. He died in 1864, peacefully and without fanfare. But after his death, the mystery only deepened. Dozens of people came forward claiming they had suspected the truth all along. Locals, priests, Even former military officers who'd once served under Alexander said Fyodor's identity had always felt royal. In fact, members of the Romanov family generations later would admit in private letters that they believed Feodor Kuzmich was indeed Alexander I. No official confirmation ever came. No DNA test has proven it. But in the quiet corners of Russian history, the legend remains that the Tsar who conquered Napoleon, who bore the weight of an empire and the guilt of betrayal, didn't die in Taganrog. He walked away. And in doing so, perhaps he found something no throne could offer: peace. In a world where power corrupts and history forgets, maybe the greatest act of leadership is learning how to let go. So here's where things get strange, and where mystery slowly starts to feel like a cover-up. You see, Alexander I wasn't just any ruler. He was the man who stared down Napoleon, who ruled over 1/6 of the world and who wrestled with guilt, God, and government every step of the way. But as powerful as he was, he often talked about wanting to walk away from it all. Yes, historians agree. Alexander openly expressed his desire to retire from public life, even hinting at abdication. Imagine that, an emperor willing to give up everything, just to escape the crushing weight of the crown. He once confessed that he would rather live in a small cabin in the countryside than on the throne in St. Petersburg. For a Tsar, that's not just unusual, it's revolutionary. And then came the strange details surrounding his death in 1825. He didn't die in the capital. He didn't die surrounded by ministers or foreign dignitaries. Instead, he died, allegedly, in a small port city called Taganrog, hundreds of miles away from the center of power. He had taken an unexpected trip there for his health. But why Taganrog? Why not a royal retreat? Why not somewhere safe? And here's the part that sent rumors spiraling. When his body was returned to St. Petersburg, it was sealed in a closed casket. No one, outside of a small circle, saw the corpse. Witnesses described the body as unusual. Some said it didn't look like the Tsar at all. The funeral? Quick. The burial? Hasty. No time for a state ceremony befitting an emperor of his stature. Now, let's jump ahead. In Siberia, nearly a decade after Alexander's death, a mysterious monk began to appear on people's radar. His name was Feodor Kuzmich. But he wasn't like the others. He was soft-spoken, extremely well-educated, fluent in French and German, languages only nobility were taught. He read religious texts in Latin. He had perfect royal posture. Monks who met him said he carried himself like a man who'd once ruled. And here's where it gets even more curious. Fyodor would sometimes speak about life at the royal court, not as if he'd read it in books, but like someone who had been there. Like someone who had seen the chandeliers in the Winter Palace and heard the echo of his own footsteps down those marble halls. One monk remembered Fyodor saying, "Power is a burden man was not made to carry." That doesn't sound like a wandering hermit. That sounds like a man still haunted by a throne he left behind. And perhaps the most startling clue came exactly 100 years after Alexander's supposed death. In 1925, the Russian Orthodox Church unofficially recognized Feodor Kuzmich as a saintly figure. Think about that. Not as a former emperor, not as a ruler, but as a holy man. A man who walked away from luxury, from war, from politics, to find peace in the wilderness. So what do we do with all of this? Are we talking about coincidence or confession? Maybe AlexanderI did die in Taganrog, broken by the weight of leadership. But maybe, just maybe, he faked his death, shed the robes of royalty, and became the only Russian emperor to walk away, not in disgrace, but in search of redemption. And if that's true, then the greatest story of his reign didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in silence, in the quiet corners of Siberia, where a man once called Your Majesty chose to be known only as Fyodor. So now we arrive at the final question. Did Alexander I truly die in 1825? A ruler worn down by politics, haunted by his past, consumed by guilt over wars and assassinations, and, ultimately, crushed under the crown he once sought to reform? Or did he do something unthinkable? Did the man who ruled over millions, who walked the gilded halls of the Winter Palace, who stared down Napoleon himself, simply vanish? Slip into the shadows of his own empire, not as a fugitive, but as a seeker of something kings are rarely allowed to possess: peace. Think about it for a moment. We're taught to imagine royalty as figures of endless privilege and power. Thrones, crowns, armies, legacy. But rarely do we ask, what if that's not what they truly wanted? What if, behind the heavy velvet curtain of the empire, stood a man who just wanted to stop being Your Majesty and start being human again? Alexander's life was defined by contradiction. He was a reformer who became a reactionary, a liberator of Europe who imposed order at home, a believer in divine justice who may have allowed the murder of his own father. He won wars, changed maps, influenced history, and yet, in his final years, he withdrew more and more from court, from people, from power. And then, he died, far from the capital, behind closed doors, buried in haste, mourned in silence. But the legend didn't die with him, because in the cold corners of Siberia, a humble monk named Feodor Kuzmich lived a life of quiet dignity. He offered no proof, gave no interviews, made no claim. But those who met him knew, or at least felt they knew. Maybe he wasn't Alexander. Maybe he was just a learned man touched by divine wisdom. But the mystery doesn't lie in proving it. It lies in why the legend exists at all. Why do we want to believe that a man so powerful would walk away from it all? Maybe because deep down, we understand something that history books rarely say aloud. The truest act of strength is not to conquer the world, but to let go of it. If Alexander did fake his death, it wasn't to escape justice. It was to escape expectation, to trade the weight of command for the freedom of silence, to finally be alone with his thoughts, his God, and maybe his guilt. And if he didn't? If the emperor truly died in that distant room in Taganrog, then perhaps his final gift to the world was this: a mystery so rich, so timeless, that it still invites us to ask, what would we choose if power and peace stood before us? Because in the end, whether Alexander died as a czar or lived on as a monk, the real story isn't just about disappearance. It's about a man caught between two worlds, one of duty and one of redemption. And maybe, just maybe, his soul finally found what his empire never could: stillness. What do you believe? Tell us in the comments.